Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. My name is Todd Embley and I am your host, and I'm really excited to welcome today Joanna Hutchins to our program. Joanna is an expert on brand growth and innovation. She has extensive experience in the China market across a variety of product sectors. And not only that, she is an adjunct professor at Duke University's China campus. And most importantly, she has written a brand new book called Chinafy: Why China is Leading in Innovation and How the Rest of the World Can Catch Up. We're going to talk all about that and more. Joanna, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Todd. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So, as we usually do, where are you currently in the world that you're recording from today?
So I'm currently in Singapore. You mentioned the new book that I've written, and my publishers are here in Singapore. The book's launching very soon. And so I'm here meeting with them and talking about that, which I have the luxury to do now that China has opened the borders and allowed for travel. So.
That's right. So we're recording this in February, and we will be releasing this right around your book launch to try and coincide with that. Kudos and congratulations on
Thank
that,
you.
by the way. I can only imagine how much work, and I'm sure you're in those final throes of putting all the finishing touches on that release right now.
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah, it's been quite a journey.
I can only imagine. I've never written a book, but having even just done this podcast for 4 years, I can only imagine how much work goes into that. So let's start with, if you don't mind, maybe I could ask you to give a quick introduction into yourself and the work that you do.
So today I'm working as a fractional CMO, which is mainly with small to medium-sized businesses, helping them scale and grow. And also innovate to address the markets and the needs of the markets that they play in. And what I found really useful, because I do come from a large corporate background, and I suppose we'll talk about that a bit more. And I've spent a lot of time in China. I'm using a lot of the China growth principles to help companies overseas use the same principles that Chinese businesses are using to scale and grow, to grow their businesses in other countries. So it's almost to some degree taking the China insight and extrapolating that and using it to drive exponential growth for other businesses in the world.
Right. As somebody myself from venture capital and from tech and working with startups a lot, I understand what the term fractional means when it comes to CMO or CTO or such. Could you maybe just explain a little bit about what that fractional CMO means in relation to being a full-time CMO?
Sure. I mean, essentially, in its most basic sense, it's part-time. But really what it means for the businesses is that they get senior level experience, someone who operates at a C-suite level, but they engage with them for a fraction of their time. And this takes shape in different ways. Sometimes, you might work a certain number of days in the week or a certain number of hours, or you might engage in a very strategic, upstream kind of, let's define how we're going to grow, how the business objectives translate into marketing objectives. So it can be things like that. But basically it's for businesses that aren't in a position to hire a full-time CEO or CMO rather, but need that level of guidance, that level of expertise to bring into the business to help shape and steer their marketing and strategy activities.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's also tenure with the company as well. So it might be, I need somebody exemplary. I need an A player for 2 days a week for 2 years, to really help position us and grow awareness or whatever kind of the scope is. But, again, resource constrained type companies are one, but also ones that have a very particular need. They need the best, but they really don't have even, maybe enough work or enough capacity or what have you. So yeah, as we've started to get innovative with the type of roles that people like yourself can have, it opens up a lot of opportunities for you to get very specific and really kind of hone in on that one particular role, right?
Absolutely. And I think you're right in the sense that you talk about the two different sort of use cases for fractional executives, and I think that's exactly right. I do find it tends to be businesses that either the idea is there and they've demonstrated proof of principle, but they don't necessarily know how to scale consumer adoption, for example. And that's where marketing CMO can come in. So I find it tends to be businesses on the smaller side, or either businesses of a medium size who have hit a growth spurt, but now have reached a bit of a plateau and need to figure out what to do to push things to the next level. So it's super interesting because I come from a mixed background of big corporate and small business and startup, and quite a lot of there's a lot of exchange in those principles in terms of best practice, but in other ways you're also building the car as you're driving it, which is very China, right? So you're sort of figuring things out as you go and leveraging your expertise and your knowledge. And, if you've seen something a million times, instantly, as an experienced executive, whether you're a fractional CMO or a fractional CFO, you know how to guide and steer the team at that particular point in their growth.
Yeah, and I've seen that result come to fruition in a couple of different ways. It can be founder led, where it's a founder relationship that engages that. But I've also seen that from the institutional VC side, where I've seen Sequoia say, we will give you $5 million, but part of what you're going to do with it is that we're going to take our friend who had spent 5 years at YouTube, and we're going to plant her in your company 1 day a week, and you're going to pay her, $50,000 a month for a year to do this one particular thing, and we're going to make that a part of the deal. And so yes. I've seen it come in different ways. So, okay, great. Now let's go back into your history a little bit. And I want to ask, how did you end up in that area of the world to begin with?
Well, I'm originally from the US, and I was working in advertising for about 10 years in New York. And then I decided I wanted to go what we say in that part of the world, we go client side, because I really wanted to own brands, drive business, and the marketing advertising side was just one little piece of the pie. So I ended up joining Unilever. I was in the US, and this was at the time of BRIC expansion. So, Brazil, Russia, India, China expansion, all large companies had a major BRIC push, and I got on that track. I spent some time in Brazil evaluating the market to launch some of the brands of Unilever. I spent some time in Moscow to do the same for Russia. But eventually I moved to Asia, because that was where for me, at least in my judgment, the most exciting growth potential existed. So I do remember sitting in a meeting in Europe. We were having a global brand leaders meeting, and the head of our division at the time put up a slide in the room, and it literally showed, because the Unilever's business is denominated in euro, so it had an animation of euro signs flying from North America and Europe and flying to Asia on the animation. And I thought at that very moment, I was like, okay, I'm going to follow the money. So I started, putting myself forward for jobs in Asia, and ended up spending what has been not like the last 16, 17 years of my career in Asia, and 13 of it in China.
Wow. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that work that you've done with Unilever. And I want to start that conversation talking about maybe the early days when you arrived, and the brand suite of Unilever and the products, and your sense of how they were perceived and received in market in China at the very beginning, and then how they are received, used, marketed today. And I'm asking this, full disclosure, because I believe a lot of domestic homegrown Chinese brands have really come a long way. So maybe if you could infuse into that answer, how some of the mechanisms that have changed the growth or the market share of the brands or the reception of the brands has changed due to some of the influences of the quality growth of local homegrown brands in China?
Sure. So, when I started working with China and in China, it was the early 2000s, and Unilever had been there in a joint venture capacity, and we were just in the midst of taking that back, buying out and becoming a wholly owned operating company in China. And the landscape for consumers was nascent. Somewhere around the mid 2000s, I think it was around 2000, 2008, there was the melamine milk scare, which kind of changed everything for brands and international brands. And I'll tell you what that was. So there was a local Chinese dairy company that put melamine, a chemical compound in milk, to boost the protein profile of the product. And it had the impact of I think it was 6 children dying and about 300,000 consumers becoming ill from poisoning from the product.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a local brand, and it had a huge impact on consumer trust. And what that meant, at that, already, I think before that, consumers were curious about international brands because China had opened up. They were starting to see these, things like L'Oreal, French Cosmetics. They were starting to see things like laundry detergent, which were new products, and that, people had never used a liquid laundry detergent and, or ever seen it or heard of it in their lives. And so these products were curiosities, and I think people were buying them out of curiosity. But it wasn't until I think that very moment where consumers really started to worry about the quality of local products. And they started to put a lot of trust in international companies because of investments in R&D, investments in safety, and investments in quality. And that started the real international product consumer boom, that the huge amount of growth that happened over the next, I'd say, 10 years. So from like 2007 to 2017 or 18 was, I would say, the era of multinational consumer brands being hugely dominant in the growth profile of all consumer goods in China. And it was really down to trust. And in fact, in Asia in general, but in China specifically, when you think about the Unilever brands, let's say I worked in personal care. So we had Dove, Pond's, Axe, in laundry detergent, there's Omo, which is, Surf in some other countries. And there's Lipton tea, a lot of the different products that were out there. In other markets like Europe and the US, there was a growing distrust of these massive conglomerates. And so Unilever was a brand that was, as a company, was minimized. They wanted consumers to think that the brands were independent, or they didn't want them to necessarily realize they were part of a larger holding company. So for example, in the US where I worked originally, there was no Unilever branding. But in Asia, Unilever branding was huge because it was a quality stamp, a sign of quality. And so a lot of the products were marketed under the big multinational umbrella. And this was the same for P&G or Colgate-Palmolive or any of the big consumer product companies. The individual brands were important, but also the corporate master brand was hugely, hugely important in marketing. And it was really down to trust and quality. And so to segue to where we are now, the quality during this time, Chinese brands were quietly growing. So the multinationals were capturing a lot of market share and really gaining a lot of consumer trust, but or based on the fact that it was pre-existing, the consumer trust. But what happened in the meantime was culturally a surge in China pride. The economy was growing. Education was improving. Lots of dimensions of quality of life in China were improving. And the younger generation was developing a real sense of pride, whereas previously maybe they felt a bit behind other countries in the world stage. They started to feel equal to other countries and economies on the world stage. And this really impacted the consumer context because they started to believe that Chinese brands could be as, they started to discover that they were as good as international brands. They could be good as, and potentially even better suited for local consumers' needs. So it's almost like, I feel like today it's almost like the multinational consumer brands are on the off ramp in the Chinese consciousness, and the Chinese brands are on the on ramp of the Chinese consciousness. And so these big multinationals are really under threat in China, and I think struggle to compete with the attractiveness and the relevancy of local Chinese brands.
Yeah. I remember how big Dove was. It was everywhere. And somebody who, when I went there, I wasn't in the game of any game, so to speak. I was kind of just traveling around in 2007. And even somebody not in the vertical, I really noticed, I was like, wow, like Dove is a known brand back home, but it is everywhere here. It was unbelievable. Yeah. So they had done a really, really good job. You were also a pioneer of e-commerce for Unilever. So I would like maybe to first ask you to, I'm getting you to be a bit of a historian here at times, but talk to us a little bit about what that experience was like. For those who don't know, back in, the beginning of the internet and digital kind of commerce days in China, say 2010, 2012.
Right. So it was interesting because e-commerce, China is the largest market for e-commerce in the world, and 80% of consumer goods are bought on e-commerce in China, which is just mind blowing to anybody from any other country. But in 2010, it was zero. 0% really. And US already had, things like Amazon had a global presence. China was decidedly behind. But what was interesting about e-commerce is that, based on the growth potential you saw in other large markets, you knew it was going to be a fundamental channel. The question was how to participate. And so, at first it was a bit confusing for marketers in China who were used to doing, I would say, selling pallets of products through distributors to retailers. And here you had to set up a store, your own store, typically. And I'll back up for a second to explain what I mean by store. So first it was Alibaba, which was B2B sales. Then Taobao came around, I think, 2009. And that was typically businesses to consumer. But it was sort of more independent businesses. Then Tmall came, which was branded companies. And there was a quality assurance with Tmall. You were buying direct from the manufacturer. Whereas on Taobao, at that time, you were never really sure, if the product was exactly what you thought you were buying. So Unilever entered into Tmall, as did many other brands, with a Unilever store selling, under their umbrella, all the products, as did L'Oreal, as did P&G. The biggest problem at the time was, and I was working, like I said, in personal care and skincare, we were selling products. I'll use US dollars for reference. We were using products that were selling for maybe like $1.50, $2 US, like a tube of toothpaste or a skin cleanser. And actually fulfilling that order costs more than the product itself. So for a period of time, as we were experimenting with e-commerce, Unilever and no one else was making money, but it was about piloting and trying and figuring out how to make it work, because knowing that this was going to be a big channel in the future, we needed to understand the economics of it and how to scale it. But I think that where we really cracked the code was realizing at some point it wasn't necessarily about solving this problem of, how to fulfill the order for the $2 product. What the potential of e-commerce was to enter second, third, and fourth tier cities without investing in distribution. So what fundamentally transformed our thinking around e-commerce was most multinationals were in first tier cities. And but when I say first tier cities, just to be clear, we're talking, like Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Chongqing. Those cities were well covered with international companies, with distributors, and products were readily available. But tier two, smaller cities, tier three, we're getting into more rural communities, and tier four villages. There was a big expansion obstacle, which was how to ship the products there, land logistics. There was a big challenge around distribution. There were no retail chains per se, so it wasn't as if you could go to, let's say, a Walmart and say, we want to be in your other cities. The retailers were very local, so from a sales point of view, developing those relationships would have been time-consuming, cost-prohibitive. Having individual relationships with individual store owners. We just, even a company the size of Unilever didn't have enough staff to cover that kind of investment in time and energy. So e-commerce became a shortcut for distribution for all these companies. So you no longer needed to worry about stores, shipping and supply chain and logistics of getting pallets of product to retailers or negotiating individual contracts with retailers. You actually just could ship directly to consumers. So, and this it became a virtuous circle because it unlocked the potential for companies with these consumers. It unlocked the potential for these consumers who are earning more money and leading middle-class lifestyles to have access to products they previously didn't have access to. And it just flourished off the back of that kind of value exchange between company and consumer.
Yeah. How amazing. I'm giving you the answer. What are your thoughts and your opinion, not mine, on the logistics and transportation that China has really invested in? And, what we have known even from 5 years ago, about how that has, in my opinion, just really enabled e-commerce to completely boom and, like you said, be 80% of how shoppers buy today.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, I write about some of this in my book, and I think one of the things China is particularly good at is enabling innovations, right? That help the larger platform scale. So one of those enabling innovations is the delivery system that has developed. I've been in China for the last 3 years during the pandemic and unable to travel. So to some degree, I had a bit of reverse culture shock when I went to see my family in December for Christmas for the first time, realizing that, even Amazon Prime is 2 days. And I'm used to ordering something and getting it, and like anything
You're
I could possibly imagine.
Snob now.
Yeah. So, I mean, if literally, I mean, the delivery is real time. Obviously, there's autonomous delivery in China, which people don't really understand. That's a whole new frontier of vehicles in neighborhoods. So, if you run out of diapers in the middle of the night, you don't have to go anywhere. You just, in 10 minutes, you can have a package of diapers at your door. I mean, it's incredible. And this is where I think a lot of countries sort of miss out on it. There's a lot of focus on the upstream kinds of innovations, digital platform, like we're building a platform for e-commerce, we're building a platform for social commerce, but those are only as effective as enabling infrastructure around the logistics that support them. And that's where China's really focused and made a huge point of difference. And so when I see things like, Pinduoduo launching Temu in the US, which, sort of their challenge to Amazon.com, I'm thinking to myself, knowing what they know about logistics in China, people are saying, people don't want to buy, perhaps people don't want to buy lower priced products. And I'm thinking you're missing the point. Not only do people want lower priced products because we're in the middle of an inflationary crisis in the US, but they also will be charmed and amazed by the customer service and the experience of having products come to them in a relatively, as real time as it can be, considering the current infrastructure in the US. And what those companies will do is they will innovate in spaces, these enabling innovations that make them more successful, I do believe, than the other competitors.
Correct. And kind of leading off of that, there was one question I wanted to maybe, close out, specifically talking about Unilever, was just your thoughts on what is it about Unilever that allows them to be so effective and be so innovative for so long?
It's an interesting question, because I think some people would even challenge the question. If you look at Unilever's stock price, they hit a high in 2019 and have been on a downward trajectory. Unlike
companies have.
But unlike P&G or L'Oreal, who've hit a peak in 2022. So there's something. It's an interesting time for these large multinational consumer companies. I think they're under threat by all the startups, not just in China, all the brand disruptors, the direct to consumer products that are coming in. And I do think that they're going to have to innovate in ways that perhaps their skill sets don't allow them to currently. So they're going to have to really think through what the business model is moving forward and how to engage consumers who are attracted to smaller, younger consumers, especially, who are attracted to smaller, more human, more local brands. However, that said, to your question, I think how Unilever has been successful in the past is really looking to each market about the specific needs. So one of the key things I noticed when working with them during the BRIC expansion time was the willingness to adapt the portfolio and adapt products and develop specific products for specific countries to better meet consumers' needs. So I think as a company, they're incredibly consumer focused. I do think the problem is, though, moving forward, is that because they're a global company with a footprint in so many places, that hyper-localization is unachievable. And that's where these smaller, more, let's say, indie disruptive brands are really, any one of those brands might not climb to a certain height, but let's say dozens of them are in the process of chipping away at companies like P&G and Unilever and L'Oreal, for example, in some of those categories that I'm very familiar with, like beauty and personal care.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, thank you for taking that on. I appreciate that. As we were, looking into your background and understanding you better to put together some of the topics that we wanted to discuss for the podcast, we came across elements of design being very important in your career. I wanted to ask you to speak to the intersection of design and its impact on business growth, and then also the importance of really great design when it comes to the China market.
Right. So I think, design is more of a servant, and I would say the master is the brand. So what I mean by that is design is a very important mechanism to express what you want to express about a brand, creating points of differentiation, creating something that's sort of magnetically attractive to consumers, creating something that's recognizable. So if you think about design, it's an important tool. And even more so now, experience design is hugely important. How brands create experiences beyond the product, how you discover the product, how the moment of, not just the moment of purchase, but the experience of using it. So many people don't encounter products in the same way that they used to. If you think about consumer products, China, case in point, that's 80% of consumer products sold online. I mean, people aren't going to the shelf anymore, and they're not sort of standing there faced with 10 options and picking one because because something about the design attracts them. You have to design in different ways for end use. So a lot of what creates brand differentiation, in my opinion, and makes brands stand out is design, and design of the product, design of the user experience. And just going back to Unilever, if you think about Unilever, I mean, fundamentally, the vast majority of products Unilever sells are commodity products, right? It's like soaps for hair, soaps for body, soaps for face, soaps for laundry, soaps for the kitchen, soaps for the bathroom. I mean, they are commodity products, but what makes them different are the brands that they create, and design is a fundamental part of creating an attractive brand that consumers want and want to keep buying. To get to your point about China, I think Chinese consumers probably rate design and purchase decision more highly than consumers in other countries. They're more attracted to bold, fresh, fun expressions, and they tend to choose those. They tend to choose products often based on appearance, but they're also much more permissive of design leaps. So, for example, that's why like brand collaborations, you see things like the most recent thing, Coach and White Rabbit coming together for Chinese New Year. I mean, a dime store candy and a luxury brand. In the US, those kinds of collaborations aren't as permissible as they are in China, but it gives Coach an opportunity to design something and express themselves in quite a unique way, but still in character of their brand. And you see that with things like KFC and Karl Lagerfeld in China, which, the opposite end of things. So KFC partnering with Karl Lagerfeld and designing, the bucket for the fried chicken. And so all these sorts of Chinese consumers crave variety. They crave novelty. They're much more, I think, like greedy in that sense. They just want something fresh and new and fun all the time. And design is a real element of that for the Chinese consumer, probably more so than in other countries.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I could see it in the future, maybe a Yeti designed KFC bucket of chicken. um, are there some international companies that you might point to, be willing to point to, who you think, and just call them out, some whose design is particularly effective in China, or that you're just kind of in love with right now?
I mean, I mentioned the Coach White Rabbit collaboration. I
Yeah.
think some of the collaborations are really interesting. In the luxury space, Prada did vegetable wet market takeovers, designing those. I think that was in 2020. Yeah, it was 20. It was either late 2021 or early 2022 before all the lockdown started. So it was a really fresh, innovative way to engage consumers with Prada design, but in an unexpected kind of place. So I think luxury brands are doing super interesting things in China. They're being very experimental, and they're capturing attention in ways that maybe in other countries is sort of hard to imagine. But on the consumer side, the more everyday products, I think Pepsi is doing really great work. They've been customized. They have a lot of own brands in China, not just the global ones, but they're doing a really good job customizing the product, limited editions, different designs, really mining local insight. And what's interesting, I think, is that Pepsi as a company, like a lot of companies, have stopped using agencies, and they brought it all in-house. And they really they have a team that they allow to play and create. And then because the barrier to entry is relatively small, they can throw it up on e-commerce, see if it does well. If it doesn't, no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
And Pepsi's become incredibly agile, using design as a brand lever in China.
You led right into what I wanted to maybe call out next was, maybe in your opinion, could you say that for a lot of brands, maybe China is the most effective sandbox in the world right now to go play in, to really kind of, flex your design muscles and really try out some new stuff.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, when I came to China with Unilever some years ago, they had moved the global R&D center for skincare to China, because one of the things that we found was if we developed things in Europe or the US and sent them to China, the hit rate was hit or miss. Like the win rate was sort of unpredictable. But if the things we developed in China and exported always did fairly well. And that was 15 years ago, right? So today, I think what's really interesting for brands and businesses is using China as an experimental playground, because Chinese consumers, they are notoriously fickle, but when something grabs their attention, it explodes. And they're very permissive. So, for example, they give brands and businesses a lot of leeway to try new things. They don't penalize them if it doesn't make sense or if it fails. There's no sort of like penalty, like, what are they doing? I don't understand them. I'm not going to buy them anymore, like you might see in North American markets, for example. So brands and businesses, it's a great incubator, I think, China, to explore different innovations, different products, different brand expressions. And there's really no consumer penalty for failure.
Yeah. I think that low penalty cost. I think not like it used to be, but lower cost to innovate. I think you can and you can do it faster, getting higher quality data and feedback loop timeline. Just a lot of little things that I think in aggregate make up a really big part of the decision to actually go and do things there. I think it is a market, and it's and the trend, the up and to the right of where Chinese consumers are placing on having influence and potentially global influence. This is a place that I think more brands do want to go and play, because the learning will be usable across multiple, even globally.
Agree, 100%.
Okay. All right. We'll pin in that, because we need to get to talking about your book, Chinafy, Why China is Leading in Innovation and How the Rest of the World Can Catch Up. Outside of the title that tells us some, I would like you to tell us more about what is this book about and why did you write it?
So I did, in 2019, I decided I wanted to study innovation. I'd been in China for a while, practicing innovation, and I saw a lot of what was happening in Silicon Valley, and I saw a lot of what was happening, in Europe. And I felt, or wondered if I was missing a beat. So I decided to go and pursue a degree in innovation and do that, sort of an executive program, like keep working in China, but go periodically to study and do that. So I ended up going to Oxford University and to their Said Business School and doing a degree in strategy and innovation. And much to my surprise, in my studies there over the next 18 months, I felt like China was ahead. So I went with the impetus thinking that perhaps we were just doing things fast, cheap, agile, and perhaps there was something more substantial to be learned and gathered outside of China. But when I got there, what I realized is that there were no new ideas. They were just sort of reshaping existing propositions. But, so the shared economy, like how can we manipulate that in this sector or that sector? And there was nothing really happening that was as interesting as what was happening in China. And the substance behind those things, to some degree, now we see some things have failed, or have been challenged, like the WeWork business model, and some of the things at that time that were really huge, or lacking the material substance and operational excellence behind them to drive outcomes, right? So I walked away from that degree feeling like China's ahead, and I had to write a thesis. And so I wrote my thesis on that. And my thesis, in fact, the title was "It's Time to Start Copying China," which was a bit like putting a play on little tongue in cheek, which I wanted to call the book, but the publisher said that might be a little too in your face, so we have a different title. But that was the point. And I said, maybe it's time to start copying China, because when I look at what the West is doing, it's not that it's not interesting. It's just that it's not driving as much commercial impact as what's happening in China. So I feel like China's really driving the global economy. These things are interesting, but China's perhaps ahead. And so the book came to be from my studies and my thesis, which then my professors later said, this is an interesting topic. You should really consider turning it into a business book. So that's what I did.
Awesome. Let's talk about some of the examples of how we, and how you've researched and unearthed and potentially written about. And I don't necessarily want you to, give away all the secrets in the book. We'll save those for people to go and read for themselves. But some concrete examples maybe around how China has really out-innovated the West.
I mean, I think I mentioned I visited my family in the U.S. in December for Christmas, and I ended up having some conversations with different business leaders, friends, peers in different industries, and some of the companies and examples of innovation that are really on a global scale in China, I was really surprised that they were unaware of. And so, what I uncovered in my research, I mean, the principles of the book, which I won't give, like you said, I won't give away, because I'd like for people to read it and discover it themselves, it's 8 catalysts, repeatable models from China that can, once you extrapolate the size of the population, because people have a lot of arguments about like, oh, well, of course things are growing in China because they have a captive population of so many people. They have limited competition because, especially in the digital space, because Alphabet and Meta aren't there.
They just have more data.
Yeah, exactly. So once you sort of strip away all those as much as possible, there are actually things that are completely repeatable. There are behaviors, principles. I've hinted at one of them, which is really getting down to operational excellence and innovation at the operating level to actually make the products and services or platforms work. That's one area. And so the book really digs into that. And there are companies, like I said, I was speaking to people in the US that they've never heard of, but that are definitely going to be world dominant brands. So the book itself breaks down the principles, and then it goes into case studies of Chinese businesses that are doing this successfully and how they're doing it. So it's really backed up by very detailed case studies. And some of the companies I've written about, like BYD, I was talking to some people in the US about BYD. They'd never heard of it. So I'll talk a little bit about, in case, the listeners haven't as well, I'll talk a little bit about BYD. So BYD is a company that started in around 2007, 2008. I'm not sure the exact date, but around that time. They were about 20 people. The area that they were playing in was rechargeable batteries for mobile phones. And they became a rechargeable battery company. They eventually got into bigger batteries and got into electric buses. As of 2019, they owned 80% of the electric bus market globally. So if you've been on an electric bus, you've ridden in a BYD and you didn't even know it. They've quietly innovated in spaces that are sort of unrecognizable, like electric buses, monorails, this kind of thing. And they finally decided to get into, nobody looks at the brand of monorail that you're on, right, when you're on an airport shuttle between one terminal to the next or in a tourist attraction. But now they're in electric vehicles and cars, priced at about $15,000 US. So very entry level pricing. They're expanding globally. I believe they're going to be the world. I mean, well, they are now actually by volume of manufacture based on the markets that they're in, which is largely China. But nobody's been able to produce a car at the price point that they've been able to produce with really advanced features. Like they have a self-parking feature. You can, if you want to park in a tight space, you can get out of the car and let it park itself. You don't need clearance for the door. It's got air pollution controls and filters in the vehicle. And this is for $15,000, which is a fraction of the price of a Tesla.
Yeah.
And so
they're backed by a relatively well-known American investor as well.
Yeah. I mean, Warren Buffett, he put in, what was it? I'm looking at my notes because I have the number, because I find this super interesting. And 2008, he invested $232 million, which today that investment is worth $7.7 billion US.
Not a bad return.
Not a bad return.
And what does BYD stand for?
Build your dreams.
Build your dreams.
Yeah.
That's I don't know if that would I don't know how a name like that would fly in North America. I think people would find that just to be a little bit hokey. But in China, I think it's that is part of the kind of colloquial nature of China as well, right? And they love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of come to symbolize the China dream in a way. So it's super, super interesting company. As you mentioned, Warren Buffett's invested in, he's got more invested in BYD than he does in GM, which sort of says something about where he's placing his bets. It's now in the world's top 150 most valuable companies, in the world, and they're pursuing global expansion. So, like, as countries, in Europe or the US want to get on board with this shift to electric vehicles, and you think about how to enable and make that happen, the biggest issue is around, availability at certain price points. Right now, obviously there's things like the Toyota Prius and other hybrids, but this company and their offer will be the most effective tool for countries and societies to move and go electric, as cities in China have done. Shenzhen, where BYD is based, 100% electric. All the taxis, all the public transport, all the passenger vehicles are now 100% electric. And so these kinds of companies and what they're doing to achieve this. So the notion of how do you make a car with that many functions and that level of performance at $15,000 is something that China has excelled in, and that the rest of the world needs to learn from to be competitive. Because if they don't, that's why I'm saying, to some degree, that's why I'm saying it's time to start copying China. Because if you don't really understand how a company like that can make a product like that, you can't compete.
Is there a cultural barrier, though? And maybe cultural isn't the right word. I mean, China was able to advance so quickly because they had no ego. They really had no pride, and they weren't going to be holding on to. They just simply knew, hey, right now, learning from the others is probably going to help us grow and learn and innovate faster. So let's do that. I think that it's going to be harder to turn the table and go the other way, because I think that we have some ingrained inhibitions or blind spots from the West. Call it ego, call it pride, call it ignorance, where, they're going to blow by us and we may say, oh yeah, no, that didn't happen.
That's, as I was talking to publishers about the book, some of them were saying to me, it's a really interesting book, but we're not sure anybody wants to buy a book about how China's doing better, and that was a challenge. Maybe that's why my publisher's in Singapore.
Don't be waking people up, Joanna.
But I think that's exactly right. There's conscious or unconscious bias around how China's doing, what they've contributed. There's definitely people have their the perspectives around past issues and challenges around IP theft. And I think the thing that I really want to point out is that, I don't want to get into that space and those challenges, but what I want to say to people is you can hold two truths in your hand at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, which is there may have been issues with IP theft and or China copying and all the criticisms that, we're not going to defend those. But what I'm saying is that could have been happening and China could have been innovating at the same time. And you need to be able to hold two truths in your hand to really understand China. You need to be able to sort of put whatever concerns, questions, politics you have to the side. And really, if you're in business and you're not looking at what China's doing to scale innovations, the same innovations, by the way. So like if you look at digital payments, launched the same year in China and the US. And now digital payments, in China's 90% of consumers use them. And like Apple, I think Apple Pay, only 24% of Apple iPhone users use Apple Pay. As of, I think I have some numbers that I wrote down about this. As of 2019, cashless payments in China were 54 trillion, the same period in US, 98 billion, right? So they've been able to take the same technologies, regardless of where they came from, and scale them and grow them bigger. And I think if you're competing in business and you're competing in global business, you're absolutely remiss to ignore China. There are countries have their own conversations going on with China about trade, and exchange. But as a business owner, a business leader, China is your competitor. And I mentioned earlier the Pinduoduo launching, the Temu, in the US, trying to give Amazon.com a run for their money. I mean, this is very real. And so you're going to face Chinese businesses either in your own market, not necessarily, or abroad in China, but you're going to be facing them. So whether you're interested in competing or China or not, Chinese businesses are interested in competing with you. So to understand how they work, how they operate, how they grow, how they scale is fundamental. And I really believe, if you put ego and bias and maybe some degree of, because if you look at the US, there is a lot of confidence around historical performance, around, what's been achieved in the past, around the innovations of Silicon Valley. And none of that is unfounded. However, it limits sometimes your ability to see with perspective other amazing successes that are worth a closer look.
Yeah. When people would ask me in the past, because I my background is tech and innovation from a bit of a VC side, always want to talk about this copying in China, and I said, well, first of all, I wouldn't say, and they don't consider it copying; they're simply just localizing, and they don't have any issue with that type of behavior. Only you do. And it's a little bit of a contentious statement. I'm being a bit of an antagonist, but what I'm trying to say is that they don't have, let's go back and be a historian in the rule of law and the litigious culture that you take for granted and think that is how the rest of the world should act. And it's not necessarily true. And they have come and developed through a completely different type of culture. It's very much what you would consider to be the wild, wild east in nature, and it's dog eat dog and all the rest. And what you consider copying, they just consider to be smart business. And I don't think either are wrong.
No, I don't either. But, even with all, even the difference in perspective in that, if you look at something like electric vehicles, which we just talked about with BYD, Tesla's, a lot of Tesla's engine, all the inner working components of a Tesla, it's open source, right? So Elon Musk made it open source because he wanted to proliferate electric vehicles. It was more of a social mission than in that regard, in addition to the commercial mission he had for the business. So when presented with the same starting point, Chinese businesses tend to make more of it. So look at BYD. For example, compared to Tesla, I mean, I don't know the actual volume of sales, but I know they're multiple times larger than Tesla in terms of volume of sales, and value as well, but volume's huge. So even if there's different perspectives on, is it copying, what is copying, even when information is 100% available, Chinese businesses innovate and make more of it than other countries. And I think it's really down to some key principles of how they do that and how they do it differently. And we've talked about some of them already. You've hinted at, even just now, different perspective. I know in the tech world, people talk about fail forward, fail fast. There's that mantra. Chinese companies, no pun intended, build the car as they're driving it. It all just happens real time. It's not about, conducting an experiment and waiting to see what works. It's literally about things happening, in the moment. If you look at companies like Shein, the retail company, doesn't even, fast fashion doesn't even compete in China. I was talking to a nameless CEO in the US of a rather large business. And I was talking to him about Shein and fast fashion. And he says, oh, well, they have so many consumers in China. And of course, a company like that would do well. And I said, I think it's not even in China. It's based in China and it's in the rest of the world. And they're bigger than Zara and H&M combined. And he was floored and he said, why haven't I heard of this company? And they're doing things real time. They're making fashion to order. Whatever gets clicks on TikTok, they start producing. It's like very of the moment, which is, I think, a very temporal quality of Chinese businesses, like this responsiveness, that people really miss. And that's something that, speaking of copying, that perhaps the West or other countries, Southeast Asia, Africa, other regions that are trying to grow, perhaps it's something they should copy.
Agreed. We could do this forever now, but I've got so many other points I want to make and things I want to talk about, but I do want to bring it back to your book, and I do want to stay there. I think it's really important. I think a lot of this conversation, people can start to pick up what you've been putting down in that book, and that should be really exciting for people to go and get. What do you expect the major innovations to be to emerge from China in the next 5 to 10 years? And I'm going to constrain your answer and not allow you to mention AI, 5G, and now battery technology.
Oh, dear. Okay. So, yeah. I think social commerce is going to be,
yes.
It's huge in China.
Yeah.
And it's being exported right now by virtue of TikTok. I mean, my God, if you look at Facebook shares and sort of its effectiveness as a marketing tool for a lot of companies that do use it in marketing, it's really diminishing, and TikTok's rising. And they've announced they're planning to plug in social commerce globally. So I think social commerce will continue to grow in China, but that will be exported to the rest of the world as well. So I would be watching extremely closely social commerce. A lot of searches, and this is part and parcel of that, a lot of consumer searches now happen in app, not in search engine. So people are going to, TikTok and Amazon globally to do searches. Not Google or Baidu, as the case may be, or in China it's Douyin. So Douyin, Little Red Book, Xiaohongshu, all those social platforms that have built-on commerce, it's growing exponentially, but I think it's poised to explode and really explode in China and then be exported to other countries. And I think that's going to be really interesting for a lot of countries that are perhaps in a more developing stage of e-commerce, because it's going to enable them to leapfrog. Store, like, brands don't even necessarily, brands and branded stores aren't as relevant as individual sellers and spokespeople, which breeds a whole new kind of economy for individuals in different countries to start their own small businesses, and a whole new gig economy of entrepreneurs in places like India and Africa. So for me, social commerce is definitely a huge space to watch.
Yeah,
For sure.
I couldn't agree more. Again, there's a million things that I want to touch on and dive into in there, but I'm going to thank you for that. And I will keep the conversation moving forward, because I do want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time, and I appreciate you being on the show so much. I wanted to go to one more thing, because we have so many brand owners, brand decision makers as a big part of the negotiation audience. So for them, and for a lot of them that are really kind of paying attention to what we're talking about, as they pay attention to that area of the world as a potential next step for them, what lessons can they learn from China's culture of innovation?
I do believe some of the key lessons are something we haven't already touched on is the potential that exists in reverse innovation. So scaling back products and making them accessible to consumers. So scaling back features, making them accessible to lower ends of the population. If we look at, so this is, I've already talked about things like enabling innovations in execution and operations, so I won't retouch on those, but a new thought I'll bring to the table is that of reverse innovation. So one thing that China's done particularly well, and even Western companies in China, like GE has done this exceptionally well in China, which is scale back some of their medical products to make them more accessible to small clinics, as opposed to like $50,000 pieces of equipment that exist in major hospitals. But even companies like Xiaomi, which have made, basically cell phones, but also the Internet of Things, the IoT home devices, incredibly accessible. And I believe brand owners really need to be thinking in reverse, because I know from my experience at Unilever, a lot of what we've been focused on is up trading, right? We've been focused on up trading consumer to the next level premium offer. But I think what people are missing is the bulk of consumers that sit at the bottom of the pyramid, and there's gold in that bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And whereas margins might be lower, but markets quantity might be bigger, don't sleep on the data and the learning that can be mined and potentially be more usable with more data. And so there are some ancillary benefits to existing in the lower end, less featured market profiles, right? Okay, great.
Well, the interesting thing, actually, to build on that, the interesting thing is it can open up new use cases. So this is not a Chinese company, but GE did reverse innovate the EKG machine so that hospitals in China and India could afford it, smaller clinics, smaller hospitals, even doctors' offices. However, what that enabled was that same product to come back to Europe and North America and be installed in ambulances, which gave better treatment and better care to emergency patients, because they could get the diagnostics they needed to make some quick decisions. So reverse innovation, yes, the margins can be lower, or not can be, they are lower. But they can open up additional use cases in the more, developed markets or more affluent markets, which creates a whole new business potential. So I think that's why companies shouldn't be afraid of exploring that kind of innovation.
Right. Yeah. And for those who don't know, this fall, look forward to Joanna Hutchins' next book, Don't Sleep on Smaller Margins. Do you see Is it possible even for China's pace of innovation to actually speed up over the next few years?
That's an interesting question. I would say probably. I think the enabling technologies that we, AI, generative AI, will enable them to will enable everybody if they use them, but is already enabling China to execute more quickly. Respond like when because I'm from a consumer background, so consumer responsiveness is really everything. And so if you can respond real time to, let's say it's raining outside, which triggers a consumer to think about your particular kind of product, and you can produce, let's say, an asset on e-commerce that speaks to that need in that moment. I think real-time marketing is going to become a thing, and China's already starting to do that and will pioneer it, which I believe will only continue to kind of like a virtuous circle or a flywheel start to develop an incredible amount of speed.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder if there simply almost mathematically has to be a peak to how, the velocity of innovation akin to, and maybe I hope I'm drawing on my old physics training successfully here, in that, part of the reason traveling at the speed of light was nearly impossible was because your mass would become infinite as you got close to infinite speed type of thing. And that, inherently was the issue. And so I wonder if potentially China might run into that problem. The same way corporate innovation is almost an oxymoron in of itself. Yeah. I wonder if it's possible for China to just kind of really max out.
Yeah, and I probably for sure. But then I think that if you think about cycles of development, innovation cycles, that I imagine this would just start a new curve, a new innovation curve. So if you think about the S curves in the cycle of innovation, I think yes, there'll be there. You can reach a peak point of this technology, but that will just generate a new S curve on however that makes us as a society, globally or in China, smarter, better, more fit to compete.
Okay. Now I want to speak to the investors, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the capital allocators that listen to our podcast. And, and full disclosure, we never give explicit investment advice, although we maybe have given implicit investment advice along the way. Do you have 2 or 3 ways that maybe they can get involved to be able to ride the innovation wave in China that we have been rather emboldening through this conversation, or even particular trends that they can focus on that they may want to be interested and maybe haven't heard of, allocating it, some capital towards?
Yeah, I still think, we've already talked about electric vehicles, and, that might be already not priced at value.
A little room left.
Maybe a little room left. But I think consumer products are really interesting. There's a case study in the book about, which a lot of people have heard of, this company called Yankee Forest that's given Coca-Cola a run for their money in China. It's a soft drink company that basically the guy came from gaming and started, used all of his knowledge around, gaming and data and consumer insight around a certain target audience to create a soft drink company. Now, he had no particular interest in beverages. He just saw, and I think this is the insight I'm pointing to, which is, I think his quote, if I'm not mistaken, was something like, China doesn't need more platforms. It needs, there's no shortage of that, and they're strong and they're good, these digital platforms, digital ecosystem. But what China needs is more exciting brands. And I think his insight about why he created that business is very true about the future potential of China consumer brands. So, that brand in particular, and I know I'm not giving investment advice to invest in that brand at all, but what I'm saying, I think what they've done in the consumer product space, disrupting huge incumbents, international incumbents like Coca-Cola, is super interesting. And I think the consumer space is ripe for that. If you look at Perfect Diary that disrupted L'Oreal, while they're not as strong as they used to be, there are companies, small up and coming companies, which are poised to disrupt rather entrenched consumer segments. And I think that's really worth a look, and that's what the Ginkgo Forest founder did. He looked at a segment that was relatively unchallenged, and he decided on beverages. But they're going to be Chinese entrepreneurs taking their tech knowledge and moving it into sectors where the incumbents don't have tech knowledge. Like, Coca-Cola is not fundamentally a tech company.
No.
So I think for me, that's a space that's interesting. What can tech disrupt in the consumer segment? And those are just a couple of examples that are sort of maybe the moment's passed on those, but what are the up and coming spaces in which that can happen?
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. I want to ask you to please now talk about, where people can get the book, remind us what the title of the book is. And I know that we are recording this pre-launch, but where do you know that it is going to be available? So tell everybody, and here we go. Shameless plug. I want you to tell us everywhere that we can get this book.
Sure. So the book is called Chinafy, How China's Ahead in Innovation and How the Rest of the World Can Catch Up. And my name is Joanna Hutchins. I'm the author. It will be available in Southeast Asia, UK, and US. Digital copies will be out in March on Kindle and Google Play. It will be available in April in physical hard copy in stores in Southeast Asia, because the publisher, as I mentioned, is in Singapore. So it's being printed in this part of the world, and then it will trickle over to the US and the UK maybe a month or two later, and it will be available on Amazon.com or any place books are sold.
All right. So talk to your friends that are based in Singapore, get yourself a copy of the book, and beat everybody else to it. I love it.